Welcome. We just got to record a podcast about Carl Jung and his near-death experience, which was really fun. Being identical twins, we do sometimes suffer from a syndrome that we like to call the giggles.
How are you doing today?
Doing good. Dude, I was in a good flow there where we can't quite stop laughing.
So today we thought we
And once we recovered from that, which we eventually did.
Welcome back to the podcast, Jay, for our second one.
It was really fun to read through and discuss Carl Jung's NDE together. So hope you enjoy.
Welcome, Jay, for our second podcast.
Yeah, great to be back.
So today we're talking about Carl Jung's near-death experience. For those that don't know, Carl Jung is one of the founders of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud was the first main founder of psychoanalysis, and Carl Jung was born in 1875, and he was only 25 when Freud officially launched psychoanalysis with his first book in 1900. And Freud saw Carl Jung as his heir apparent, who is a brilliant up-and-coming analyst, writer, speaker, psychologist, and Freud really wanted Jung to be the successor of the psychoanalytic movement. And this is the book. It's his autobiography, his memoir called Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. It's really amazing. We recommend anyone who's interested to read it because there's a lot of personal stories and it's his most revealing personal account. So we thought it would be a good topic for us to talk about today.
Yeah. And some in the audience might know, but both of us are marriage and family therapists. So we both got master's degrees in psychology, and we both read this book when we were doing the master's program at separate times. And we've both been fascinated about Carl Jung because much of psychology today is actually quite medical. It's based on data and science and a lot of medication. There's stuff like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. We try to solve for certain behavioral or mental problems and challenges through kind of like self-help type steps. But Carl Jung was a real explorer into the unconscious. He coined terms like the collective unconscious and the shadow. And he was really fascinated with comparative religion, with mythology, with alchemy, with spiritual experiences. And so he really explored the whole full spectrum of what we might call the supernatural or the occult or the transpersonal. And so his memoir, we very much recommend to anybody. It's an incredible book about growing up in Switzerland at the turn of the 21st century. And he has a lot of visions and dreams. And he's also a very profound scientific thinker. And his laying the groundwork for psychoanalysis and psychology was an incredible experience. So excited to be talking about Dr. Jung with you today.
Yeah, me too.
Both of us have been really interested about the intersection of psychology with spiritual and transpersonal phenomena. So we're obviously both passionate about near-death experiences. And it's really great to track and to have a psychologist, one of the founding fathers of psychology, who also not only was interested in the supernatural, paranormal, and spiritual dimensions, what he calls the numinous dimension of the human being, but he himself had a near-death experience. So just really excited to kind of get in there, unpack his experience, and talk about it together.
I will say, I remember in 2010 when I was in grad school for psychology and I read this book and it was so powerful. I was really struck by what a strong personality he is. You know, he had like a split personality as like a child growing up. He always had crazy dreams. We'd have all these synchronicity and coincidences. He had like this access to basically a spirit, but he was very rational, very scientific, very brilliant, and was just a force of nature in his relationships, his writing. So I didn't remember that he had an NDE until a few years ago when you and I were talking about it.
Yeah. And another interesting thing about Jung is, he coined terms that are now just common knowledge in our lexicon and vocabulary, like collective unconscious and the shadow. But he also coined and discovered the term of synchronicity. So he was studying how the psyche was so mysterious that acausal relationships exist between different things inside the psyche and outside of the psyche and the world outside. So he was a spiritual and intellectual giant of the 20th century. And just great to be talking about him today. So do you want to get us started?
Yeah, let's dive right in. So Jung died in 1944. He broke his foot, was hospitalized for a couple of weeks, and then had a heart attack. And essentially, he describes it as hyperreal. And how it started was he said he started floating out in space, basically, and he saw the Earth as a globe that he said was like illuminated by a blue light, but he saw all the continents on Earth. And he was what he said later, which was, I think, in the late 40s, early 50s, the first telescope or satellites kind of came out, and he saw the first image back at Earth. And he said he didn't realize, but he would have had to have been thousands of miles away from Earth to see what the Earth looked like. When he died in 1944, there was no pictures or images of what it looked like, what Earth looked like from outer space.
He has this archetypal, iconic image of floating in space and seeing the globe, the Earth, as a marble in space. And then as he's floating through space, he sees basically a large granite stone temple. And he said it looked a lot like the temples in Sri Lanka or in India. And it was a beautiful black stone temple. And as he approached it, there was a Hindu man, somebody from the subcontinent of India or Sri Lanka, in a white robe, sitting in the lotus position by the front door. And he had this experience of feeling like everything was being stripped away from him, sloughed off, losing his personality, his ego. It's just these core parts of who he thought he was getting removed. And at the core of it was his true essence. We might call it the soul. And he said, I might read something really quick about what he said at that point, which was, as I approached the steps leading up to the entrance into the rock, a strange thing happened. I had the feeling that everything was being sloughed away, everything I aimed at or wished for or thought. The whole phantasmagoria of earthly experience and existence fell away or were stripped from me. An extremely painful process. Nevertheless, something remained. It was as if I now carried along with me everything I had ever experienced or done, everything that had happened around me. I consisted of all that, so to speak. I consisted of my own history, and I felt with great certainty, this is what I am. I am this bundle of what has been and what has been accomplished. So my one thought on that was that it seems similar to me as like what a lot of NDEers are talking about in terms of the life review. You know, they'll have an experience of reliving their actions, their good acts, their bad acts, and how that impacted and rippled out into other people's lives. It's almost like our actions, we take accounting, like the Egyptians will balance on a scale our good acts and our bad acts. And so he lost his sense of self, his ego, but he somehow what comprised his essence in that astral realm was everything he had done in that lifetime. And I just thought it was a really interesting way of describing it.
I had the same thought, which is kind of like the life review that a lot of NDEers talk about, which is, yeah, some kind of accounting or interaction with our actions, our thoughts, our deeds that are cumulative, that are kind of recorded or like preserved or witnessed. And people can describe it as painful, especially if they've done mean things, rude things, unkind things. That's the cause and effect. And which is also apparent in a lot of religious traditions too. But his description is kind of unique, and he kind of goes on to talk about it. You know, like he felt extreme poverty, but also great fullness. There was nothing he desired or wanted. So it goes into like this really beautiful, peaceful, kind of loving feeling of total contentment and in his kind of true nature, which is interesting.
Yeah. Then he has this instinct to go into the temple, right? And he has this felt instinct that within the temple are his friends and loved ones, like a group of beings that truly know him, that are his true family. And he just had this intuition that if he went into the temple, he would be returning home to his people, to his community, to his true essence, to where he truly belonged. And he said something else engaged my attention. As I approached the temple, I had the certainty that I was about to enter an illuminated room and would meet there all those people to whom I had belonged in reality. There I would at last understand. This too was a certainty. what historical nexus I or my life fitted into. I would know what had been before me, why I had come into being, and where my life was flowing. My life as I lived it had often seemed to me like a story that has no beginning and no end. I had the feeling that I was a historical fragment, an excerpt for which the preceding and succeeding text was missing. My life seemed to have been snipped out of a long chain of events, and many questions had remained unanswered. So to me, I actually see this as like him talking about reincarnation. He was snipped. He just had this life as Dr. Carl Jung, but he didn't know where he came from, what had happened before this life. He didn't know what was happening or coming afterwards. And he had this deep intuitive feeling that when he entered the other side through this temple, he was going to understand all of it, the whole course, why he had ended up there, why he had chosen that body, that life as Dr. Jung, and just have a true revelation about the purpose and the meaning of it all. And people say that in their near-death experiences. They'll say on the other side, suddenly everything makes sense. They understood exactly why they had all the suffering and the trauma and the pain in their lives. They understand why they had been born to a certain family, why they had been they all talk about it making sense in a much larger context and bigger picture.
Yeah, it's one of the things that are so fascinating about NDEs is what people often call like downloads, because everything is telepathy. And so these beings often give a download of just a deep understanding where everything makes sense. Some people suffer and die and have so much painful experiences in life, and it's like doesn't make any sense here on earth. Why is there racism, oppression, all these tragedies? But they go over to the other side, and often they are giving the greater context and experience so much peace and understanding about why they had to go through certain trials that they had to in earth. And so Jung is talking about that here, where he knows he's so close, just across the veil or outside of the temple, where he knows he can get this download. And so what happens next is he says, right when he's about to cross into the temple, his tension is pulled, he turns back to the earth, and he sees his doctor, his primary care physician, emerging from Europe towards him in outer space in what he called his primal form. And he calls it the Basilius of Cause, which is a Greek term because he's big into mythology. But it's the primal form of kind of who we are. And so they have this telepathic exchange where the doctor tells Jung, hey, you're not ready to go. You can't die right now. There's a protest on Earth. You have to come back, basically. And with that, he said this experience ended and he woke up in his hospital, which is to me a very unique part of an NDE and kind of fascinating. And there's a few aspects of that happens when he's back in the hospital. I want to read a little bit about when he returns from the NDE. As he woke up, he said, I was profoundly disappointed, for now it all seemed to have been for nothing. The painful process of defoliation had been in vain, and I was not to be allowed to enter the temple, to join the people in whose company I belonged. In reality, a good 3 weeks were still to pass before I could truly make up my mind to live again. I could not eat because all food repelled me. The city and mountains from my sickbed seemed to me like a painted curtain with black holes in it, or a tattered sheet of newspaper full of photographs that meant nothing. Disappointed, I thought, now I must return to the box system again, for it seemed to me as if the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world, had been artificially built up, in which each person sat by himself in a little box. And now I should have to convince myself all over again that this was important. Life and the whole world struck me as a prison, and it bothered me beyond measure that I should again be finding all that quite in order. I had been so glad to shed it all, and now it had come about that I, along with everyone else, would again be hung up in a box by a thread. While I floated in space, I had been weightless, and there had been nothing tugging at me. And now all this was to be a thing of the past.
Well, I just think it really mirrors what many NDEers have experienced when they come back from an experience like a near-death experience. There can easily be a real depression, a hopelessness, a frustration, a sadness of being back in this reality. Peter Panagore, who we interviewed for this channel, talked a lot about feeling depression, not wanting to be here. wanting to go back home. If when people go onto the other side, it's so real, it's hyper real, and it feels like home. It feels like the true home, our true home. That coming back here onto Earth is just a weird, like two-dimensional black and white experience. It's like you have a black and white pixelated TV, and then you go to your friend's house and they have like a HD color television, and it's like trying to come back to something that doesn't quite feel real. It feels like a matrix. And so Jung really described that, not eating, like needing 3 weeks just to recover the will to live. And he was a very successful, accomplished psychologist, world famous at that point. So I just think it's kind of remarkable hearing him talk about how hard it was to come back and really start caring and taking seriously this earthly experience.
Yeah. And it's common because a lot of people have such ecstatic, incredible, amazing experiences in the astral form or in the afterlife, whatever you want to call it. And so coming back, it sounds like, is often the most painful part of the process because we have a heavy body, needs to be fed and drink water. And it's so confusing and like feels like drudgery compared to our soul or astral form, which is full of light and love and is, you zip around. So it's always humbling to me when I hear that part of an NDE story, because I can relate to it, not having experienced it exactly. But sometimes it's hard. These bodies get sick and old.
It's true. Jung I think about that. He was so successful and so like he had helped so many people. He had done so much in his life. So if he's really struggling to come back and be back in this world, it's just like, wow, imagine everybody else. It's not easy. It's sometimes, I always dreamed like, oh, it'd be great to have an NDE. I would love that. But a lot of people report it being very challenging, having to integrate it.
Yeah. And, so it's interesting is the next part, and you can read a paragraph of that, but he then has this 3 week window where during the day is this drudgery and heaviness and he's feeling depressed. But then at night, he has these ecstatic visions and experiences, which is that liminal state from coming back. You're still close to the numinous, what he calls the numinous, close to the veil, so to speak. And so, but before we get to that part, the one other thing that's interesting is in his hospital room, he got worried about his doctor because he saw him in that vision. And on the other side, in his primal form, he became convinced he was angry at his doctor for coming to save him. And then he was worried about him because he's like, oh, he's going to die soon. Maybe he took my place. Why else would you be revealed in your primal form? Long story short, it did turn out by his account that Jung was this doctor's last patient. And the day that Jung finally could get out of bed, his doctor got hospitalized and died shortly thereafter. So that's kind of another example of Jung's intuitive abilities.
Yeah. He had many experiences like that in his life, synchronicities, intuitions, dreams, visions that told him things. And he immediately had the sense his doctor wasn't going to last long on Earth from that experience. It's interesting too. Some people report that in their NDE, seeing people who haven't died yet, who are still on Earth. So there's an interesting piece there. I'll let you finish by reading the last piece.
Sure. Jung writes, during those weeks, I lived in a strange rhythm. By day, I was usually depressed. I felt weak and wretched and scarcely dared to stir. Gloomily, I thought, now I must go back to this drab world. Toward evening, I would fall asleep, and my sleep would last until about midnight. And then I would come to myself and lie awake for about an hour, but in an utterly transformed state. It was as if I was in an ecstasy. I felt as though I were floating in space, as though I were safe in the womb of the universe, in a tremendous void, but filled with the highest possible feeling of happiness. This is eternal bliss, I thought. This cannot be described. It is far too wonderful. All these experiences were glorious. Night after night, I floated in a state of purest bliss, thronged round with the images of all creation. Gradually, however, the motifs mingled and paled. Usually the visions lasted for about an hour, and I would fall asleep again. By the time the morning drew near, I would feel the depression. He continues with, it is impossible to convey the beauty and intensity of emotions during these visions. They were the most tremendous things I've ever experienced, and what a contrast the day was. I was tormented and on edge. Everything irritated me. Everything was too material, too crude, and clumsy. Lastly, he says, although my belief in the world returned. To me, I have never since entirely freed myself of the impression that this life is a segment of existence which is enacted in a three-dimensional box-like universe, especially set up for it. So, there he's really going into detail, and it continues, which a lot of people NDEers talk about this. They often say there's no words in the English language and any language that it can grasp and articulate what their experience is on the other side. Jung is trying his best to convey that.
That was a Freudian slip, by the way.
Freudian slip. Nice one, bro. But he's definitely talking about his integration and probably digesting of this experience for many weeks in the hospital, where at night he's having these ecstatic visions and it's incredible and it's blissful and eternal. And then he comes back to the rest of the day, the other 23 hours, which he's feeling depressed or like somehow he's supposed to care about his life and world, but it feels very foreign still. Interesting dichotomy.
Yeah. I really love that last line that you read about how he's like, I can't shake the feeling that this earth is box. It's like a box puppet show. That's my words. But he said that was specifically designed for it. It's pretty amazing. He's just saying that this is like a simulation matrix set up for souls to come down and incarnate to learn. I mean, it's really exactly what all the NDEers talk about. I also think it's amazing because nobody knew what near-death experiences were at this point. He had it in 1944. He wrote this book in the 50s or early 60s. Raymond Moody hadn't yet coined the term near-death experience. So it's just pretty incredible to be hearing his first-person account of this, considering the era he had lived in and who he was as a historical person. So it's just kind of incredible. It's really a remarkable NDE, and especially in a historical context. We've talked about Plato having written the first written NDE account. And I'm really curious personally how many others there are throughout history, like maybe in Asia, in China, Japan, or in Africa. I imagine there are other accounts from other cultures in their traditions about the other side, what happens after death. And obviously the ancient Egyptians had a whole belief system based on it. A lot of cultures did. And I think it'd be really cool to invite people onto the channel to do a podcast with them, or for you and I to do some research and learn more, because there's a lot coming out now about it, obviously with YouTube and with people writing books. Advanced Western medicine is saving a lot of people's lives, but this is an ancient, age-old phenomenon. So pretty cool to be learning from Dr. Jung in this regard too.
Yeah, totally. And then, of course, he wrote many of his most prominent works after this experience. A lot of his most famous theories and books came after this, because he had so much creativity and energy after this experience, as a lot of NDEers do. And I'm totally with you in terms of the historical context and exploring other kind of famous people or historical accounts of NDEs before the 1960s when Raymond Moody brought our collective consciousness to it. Well, this was pretty fun, Jay. Thanks for diving in.
This was a really fun podcast. To record with you, E, about Carl Jung and his near-death experience. We really got into it and got to unpack it, although it did take us a little while to settle in and get going in the proper way.
How to die, find a twin, and bring him back to life for you to do all sorts of things.
How to die and maybe find something on the other side. We're not sure, but just trust us.
How to die and stay on this side.
Nice to be back on here with you, E. I'm excited to be doing another episode.
Yeah, me too. So today we thought we
That was funny.
What was so funny? Sometimes I log on to this podcast and look at your face. I go, yeah.
Okay, you just take it.
How you doing today?
Doing good. Dude, I was in a good flow there.
I know. Okay. Welcome back to the podcast, Jay, for our second one.